Hello and welcome to today's webinar session. It's for the Level 5 qualification. Today we will be discussing observation and assessment. My name is Laura Sykes.
And I'm Gemma Carr. So today we are going to be looking at the importance of play and some theoretical perspectives and how that can impact on the child's learning and development. Understand how to stimulate children's creativity and curiosity. A little bit about the planning cycle and then the use of formative and summative assessments.
So the observation, assessment and planning cycle, something that we're very familiar with within early years, but it's important that we understand how this informs practice within settings and particularly in our own settings. So, it's really important to have a look at how you do it within your setting. There are so many different ways to do observation, assessment and planning now. It's changed so much over the years. So it is kind of doing what works best for you. I know some settings that do observation, assessment and planning weekly. Some do what they call focus weeks and kind of rotate, do a child 1 week and then they have a couple of weeks where they don't, unless they particularly see a wow moment. So it's kind of knowing what cycle you use within your setting.
I think it's also important to register that some settings aren't doing conventional planning anymore. We're not doing what we learn planning as. We're not doing a sheet and we're doing those next steps. However, all of the staff are aware of the children's next steps, so they are still working on things. They are still observing. They are still assessing. And they are still planning, but it's not being done in the conventional way anymore, for want for better words, really, isn't it? It's not done in a paper format.
Yeah, no. There is so much more ownership on the key person, knowing their children, knowing, like you say, where they are, what the next steps are, and then planning in the moment. In the moment planning is very popular at the moment within early years, where you're kind of just planning ad hocly, really, as you go, based on what the children are doing, and that informs what you're doing within your setting. So the observation, assessment and planning cycle that you use will be very much embedded with your settings curriculum and your settings pedagogy.
That said, the in the moment planning, there is still process. There is still an order. There is still an understanding of those children, and that's what we want to highlight, is that although you're doing in the moment planning, that can't mean that people are getting lazy.
Yes.
And just having a nice play. Actually, we are still incorporating communication and language, because this child is struggling with it. So we are focusing on that as well. So although I've just kind of jumped into this activity, actually there is still thought behind what is happening, and being aware of those 3 I's during your activities as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So formative and summative assessments, this can often be a bit of a sticking point for people, but being aware that your formative assessment focusing on improving how the children learns, it helps to monitor the child's learning progress so that the teacher can catch the problems early and adjust their instruction method if necessary. And then you've got your summative assessment, which focuses more on evaluating the overall understanding of what children have learned. So your formative assessments would be your daily, your weekly observations, your next steps, your short, sharp bits and bobs. And then your summative assessments are for example, 2-year check or school leavers, the bigger assessment methods.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And like I say, it's really important that we know what those terms are. I think quite often in early years we don't necessarily use the term formative and summative assessment. We're definitely doing them.
Yeah.
They're there embedded within practice, but it is important that we do know what those terms are and that we share those with our team. So pedagogy. So what is pedagogy? So although pedagogy is often closely related to a curriculum, pedagogy in essence relates to how or practice of educating. So it's to do with kind of what we're teaching, how we want the children to learn within the setting. So again, pedagogy is similar to formative and summative assessment in the term that it's not always something that we've not always used that term in early years. It's still quite a new term, really, that we use now to talk about how we're teaching the children. But within your setting, you will have a way that you do this, whether it's through child-led play, whether it's through an approach. You will have a pedagogy, so it is really important that you have a look at your setting and find out what that is, and then make sure that you share that with your team.
Again, using this terminology as your everyday language, that you're talking to your team about things as well. And kind of, for me, pedagogy is the doing of what we do, how we do it, and how we support those children in the way that we do it. Yes. Is kind of what pedagogy is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking about how is observation assessment embedded into settings, curriculum and pedagogy. So one example for me is that I've worked in a Reggio inspired setting. So that would be sort of, you've got the different environments, you've got the Atelier, which is kind of exclusive to a Reggio approach, and the different ways that you support that learning. Everything's very open-ended, everything is loose parts, very promoting the imagination. So that's where it comes into that pedagogy, and thinking about the curriculum alongside it too. So then a lot of settings are working with the EYFS. Predominantly people are still working with the EYFS. However, there are some other curriculums that are being used as well now. But bringing into that observation assessment and how that is seen and how that is done. So again, observations are kind of sometimes done differently in certain types of settings, different approaches. So again, in a Reggio setting, it's very child-led, but sometimes they have even clipboards on the wall, and kind of it's more of a working document rather than sort of a hidden away or on a tablet, something like that. That's another thing, also thinking about the pedagogy of your setting. For me, when it comes to observation assessment planning, is being present, and you're observing, but actually you're not scribbling down at the moment when children are doing things and you could be engaging with them, and you're not on a tablet or a laptop typing this up whilst the children are doing things. So again, that pedagogy of being present, being with the children and engaging with them, I think is a really important of the physical element of observation assessment planning.
Absolutely, because otherwise you miss things and you miss the opportunity to extend on their learning, miss opportunity to ask questions about what they're doing. So yeah, it's really important, like I say, that we are present when we are observing and assessing children in the setting, and really important, like I say, that it is mirrored within our curriculum and pedagogy as well. And I think a big part of that is that enabling environment. So again, that can link to different approaches. It might be that it's a forest school, in which case you're following that approach. Your curriculum and pedagogy will be all around the outdoors. Will still usually have the EYFS within it, although, like you say, some settings have got their own curriculums now, but that still will very much include that observation and assessment element, but it is just very naturally embedded within that enabling environment as well.
Yeah, I think it comes back to a lot of what we've discussed previously on different sessions. It is that enabling environment, isn't it, and how we are encouraging that curriculum within what we're doing with our pedagogy.
Absolutely. So confidentiality, so really important for us in early years, obviously links to a lot of pieces of legislation, as we already know. So having confidential information means that you only share it on a need-to-know basis. It's got to be private. So, it's really important to think about how you maintain confidentiality of the children and families' information, who you share this information with. If you want to share the information with other people, what do you need to do first? Do you need to gain permission? Quite often that is the case, particularly if we're working with other professionals. We share need to know, but again, we need to get parental permission for that before we share that, before we make that referral. And when can you break confidentiality in these circumstances? What do you need to do first?
These are all quite specific to, although there is the legislation behind it, the way that you may go about it is quite specific to your setting as well, I think, isn't it? And so it's an importance to be aware of how your setting tackle confidentiality and make your staff aware of this as well. Even if that's just kind of things that you may be saying at handover. How are you discussing that with a parent at handover? Should that actually be a meeting in the office, a confidential one-to-one meeting? Or can this be something that can be essentially shared with the rest of the parents that are standing waiting as well, as small as that may be? Or it could be, like you say, sharing documents with outside agencies. How do we go about that? Even security on tablets. Can everybody access everybody's? Do they need access to everybody's? How is that being used?
Yeah, absolutely. And GDPR plays a bit of a role in there as well. And it is really important. Some settings will be using paper, some settings will be using, like you say, iPads and different apps. There's like Family and Tapestry and all these other apps out there for early years to use. And so a lot of information is on there. So yeah, it's kind of, what is the security? Do people have passwords to get in? And like I say, that will very much be embedded within the policies and procedures, and for the team to be aware of. I mean, when it comes to breaking confidentiality, the only thing I can think of is safeguarding. That screams at me. If it is safeguarding, you can breach it, but you've got to breach it to the right person. You've got to go to that distance safeguard lead. It doesn't mean you can breach it to anybody. It's still on a need-to-know basis.
And those observations that you're doing with the children and things that you're notifying as something they may be behind in or lacking, that is also confidential information. That is personal information about the child that not everybody needs to know about. Yes, the team in the room need to know about it, but anyone else? Probably not. That's not something that needs to be shouted about across the room. So being aware of that, and kind of, it's an element of giving that child respect as well. So how you can support your staff and your setting to be aware of those things. So within your one-to-one sessions with your tutor, you will be looking at different theorists and different approaches, and we'll look into them in sort of more detail. So we've kind of got a couple to touch on here, and kind of just to kind of bring light to them, really. So one of them is Susan Isaacs. And she was a psychoanalyst and educator, together to create a caring and warm environment for children, providing access to resources children may not have at home, and intellectual development and interlinks with emotional development and the importance of play. So that's all things that Susan Isaacs, as a theorist, theorised about child development, and sort of you and your pedagogy and you and your curriculum need to be interlinked as to not who your theorists are, but think about the theorists and how they can be seen in your setting. So a lot of that, and kind of providing access to resources children may not have at home. So thinking about that, is that something you can provide in your setting? Is that how your setting and your pedagogy can link to Susan Isaacs' theory? Is that something you have?
Absolutely, and that's a really important one, that home learning, supporting that. And I think what you'll find when you look at a lot of the theorists and approaches, you'll be able to pick bits out of all of them. You think, we do a bit of that in the setting, but there might be one that, as Jim said, you more strongly follow, or something that you want to kind of embed within your curriculum and pedagogy. And it is really important that we look at the different approaches, because they do embed what we do, what we do within early years, and we know play is important. It is really important, and we know it's important to support children's development and that emotional development.
Definitely, and I think that's something Susan Isaacs was about as well, was that emotional development with the children, and kind of understanding the links between it all, really. Absolutely. And that holistic development. So Susan Isaacs, just to be clear, is a theorist. She has done research herself, and then you'll come on to different approaches as well.
So one of those approaches is Montessori. And it's an approach where children are the best directors of their own development and learning. They can go on to create an environment to best do this. So it is about creating that enabling environment, following the Montessori approach, that enables children to learn and develop and be very much child-led. Observations of children become critical part of the daily life for the practitioner. So they focus a lot on observations, and then also making sure they share these observations with parents as well.
So and that's, you often see still today, you have Montessori nurseries around, and they are very clear with their pedagogy, really, aren't they? They are quite that's their pedagogy, so that's what they stick to.
Yeah.
These two are just examples. These are just two that we've kind of chosen to kind of discuss, but actually there are umpteen other ones, and those will be looked at in your one-to-one sessions as well. But for us, it's kind of thinking about how do we stimulate that children's creativity and curiosity. So one other approach that's being seen an awful lot in settings now is the curiosity approach. If you haven't heard of it, if you haven't seen it, they do have very good social media and a lot of information on their social medias about their approach, about their pedagogy, and kind of ways that you can integrate that into your setting, into your nursery. And actually, we're talking here creativity and curiosity, which unsurprisingly the curiosity approach does very well. You know, it encourages that imagination, it encourages the individual child and the curiosity that a child would naturally have is what they bring in, whilst also the importance of the natural environment, natural resources, outside environment as well, kind of bringing outside in. What's your experience with how to kind of stimulate that creativity with children?
So I think, like you say, that curiosity approach really does embed it. But it is just about giving them those opportunities to problem solve. You know, it links to that sustained shared thinking that we've spoken about within a previous session as well. And it is just giving them those opportunities, making sure they've got the resources, the environment, so they can use their imagination and be creative. They can be curious about how things work and what things do. And I think you can very much do that by having open-ended activity, open-ended resources, natural resources that can be anything. You know, if they, particularly outside, you know, if they want to explore the sticks, you know, sticks can be wands, they can be, you know, a spoon for mixing your potion. There's so many different things.
There's a book about that, isn't there? They've I can't remember, it might just be a stick, but there was someone who's written an entire book about how a stick can be anything, and it's creating that imagination of the child and how those open-ended resources can really be used, basically.
Absolutely. And you know, stick is a really good example. It's one that children will naturally pick up, and it suddenly becomes all sorts of wonderful things. So yeah, I think it is really important to have those open-ended resources, so that the children can be creative and be curious.
I think it's also, we've spoken here about the curiosity approach. This isn't the only approach that's ever spoken about creativity or curiosity. I think that curiosity is a good balance and a modern approach to childcare, but actually when you look at it, there is an awful lot of Montessori factors in there, a lot of Reggio factors in there. There are a lot of different approaches within that they've kind of taken. I like a bit of this, I like a bit of this, I like a bit of this, I'm going to put this all here. And I think that's also to be aware of. Like, you don't have to have an approach, you don't have to be Froebelian nursery to actually promote this creativity or curiosity. You don't have to label your nursery as a curiosity approach nursery or a Montessori nursery to be able to enable this style, this creativity, this curiosity in your children. I think that's important to note, that you can just do you and still be encouraging this creativity and curiosity, although these approaches do all enable it in different ways.
Yes.
I think personally, on an imagination level and on a creative level, I personally feel an approach would be your Reggio approach, would be the most suited for that, because they've got such an importance. Maybe it's a personal preference, because there is also that, isn't there? Like, they've got such an importance of having an atelier within every nursery, so having an arts room that all of the children can access. There's an atelier in every single room. Every child from that can go into the atelier at any moment and go and start being creative. They've got all of the resources to hand, they're ready to go. You've also got such an importance of the outside world, but also such an importance of imagination and everything is open-ended. Everything is open-ended in a Reggio setting. There isn't you would never find a plastic phone in a role play area of a Reggio setting, which again, personal preference, probably something that I really like. But that promoting that imagination and that creativity from children is so important and can be so easily done. You don't need to have a completely separate room. Yes, Reggio nurseries do, or predominantly they do, but you don't have to have that. It's just you can have an area for it to kind of create that creativity in them.
Absolutely, and that's what a lot of settings do have, so do reflect back on your setting and how you do support creativity and curiosity, because you might find, well, I think you will find that you're already doing it very much so, whether it's in a creative area, whether it's inside, outside, you will already be creating those opportunities and stimulating that curiosity and that creativity. So it is important to kind of reflect on, what it is that you do within your setting and see how you do that. Again, some useful resources. So just some different links that to like theorists' approaches, but also links to observation and assessment, curriculum and pedagogy as well. Please continue with your reading around these topics as well, as this will also support you with your assessments.